July 16, 1945, Mare Island Naval Shipyard, California, 2:37 a.m. Captain Charles Butler, McVeigh 3, stood on the dock watching a wooden crate the size of a small car being loaded onto his ship, and nobody would tell him what was inside. The crate moved slowly, suspended from a dockyard crane, swaying slightly in the night breeze coming off San Pablo Bay. 2 armed Marines flanked it on the dock, 4 more waited on the deck of USS Indianapolis. A man in civilian clothes, no name, no introduction, supervised the loading with the intensity of someone handling live explosives. Maybe he was. McVeigh had commanded Indianapolis for 18 months. He knew every rivet, every compartment, every system on his heavy cruiser, but he'd never seen a cargo transfer conducted with this level of secrecy. No manifest, no bill of lading, no paperwork explaining what he was carrying or where it was going beyond the first stop, Tinian Island, 5,000 miles across the Pacific. The civilian approached as the crate settled onto Indianapolis's deck. He was maybe 45, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and the pallid complexion of someone who spent his life in laboratories instead of sunlight. "Captain McVeigh," the civilian said, offering no handshake, "your cargo is secured. You'll maintain flank speed to Tinian. No deviations, no delays. This material is," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "critical to ending the war." McVeigh studied him. "That's a heavy crate for critical material. What am I carrying?" "You're carrying the future, Captain. That's all you need to know." The civilian turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the dock lights. The Marines remained, standing guard over the crate like it contained the secrets of the universe, which, as it turned out, it did. Inside that wooden box, packed in protective foam and climate-controlled containers, were components of Little Boy, the uranium-235 atomic bomb that would obliterate Hiroshima 3 weeks later, the gun-type assembly mechanism, the neutron initiators, the precisely machined uranium projectile that would slam into the uranium target at 1,000 feet per second, achieving critical mass, unleashing the power of the sun on a Japanese city. But McVeigh didn't know that. His crew didn't know that. Nobody aboard Indianapolis knew they were carrying the most dangerous and valuable cargo in human history. They just knew something was different, something was important, something was wrong. July 16, 1945, 6 a.m., USS Indianapolis, underway. The cruiser sliced through the Pacific at 29 knots flank speed, maximum sustainable velocity. Faster than most heavy cruisers were supposed to operate for extended periods. The 4 Parsons steam turbines driving her propellers howled with the strain of maintaining that pace. Hour after hour, burning fuel at a rate that would empty her bunkers in days instead of weeks. But speed was the mission. Speed was everything. Lieutenant Commander K.C. Moore stood on the bridge, calculating their course to 5,000 miles, at 29 knots, accounting for minor course corrections and weather delays. They'd arrive in approximately 10 days. Fast enough to meet whatever deadline the mysterious cargo demanded, slow enough that the crew could maintain the ship's systems without mechanical failure. Moore had served on Indianapolis since 1943. He'd been aboard during the Battle of Peleliu, during the invasion of Iwo Jima, during the kamikaze attack off Okinawa that had damaged the ship badly enough to require repairs back in California. He'd seen combat, seen death, seen what war looked like when it came for you with 500 pounds of explosives and a pilot who did UNT plan to land. But he'd never seen the Navy move with this kind of urgency. No escort ships, no destroyer screen, no air cover. Just one heavy cruiser racing across the Pacific alone, carrying something so important that normal convoy procedures had been abandoned entirely. That should have been his first warning. The second warning came from Chief Petty Officer Edgar Harrell, who'd been in the Navy long enough to recognize patterns that didn't make sense. Harrell found Moore in the wardroom during the afternoon watch change. "Sir, permission to speak freely." Moore looked up from his navigation charts. "Go ahead, Chief. Why are we running alone? Every other ship heading to the Philippines goes in convoy. Destroyers, escorts, air coverage. We're naked out here. We're fast enough to outrun most submarines." Most isn't all, so Moore didn't have a good answer for that. The truth was, he'd asked the same question during the mission briefing and received the same known answer. McVeigh had gotten, speed and secrecy were paramount. Indianapolis could maintain 29 knots. Most submarines could barely manage 8 knots submerged. The math suggested they'd be safe. The math was wrong. "We'll be fine," Chief Moore said, trying to sound confident. 10 days to Tinian offload the cargo. Then we rejoin the fleet for training exercises before the invasion of Japan. Standard deployment. Harrell nodded, but his expression suggested he didn't believe it any more than Moore did. July 26, 1945, Tinian Island, 11:42 a.m. Indianapolis arrived at Tinian exactly on schedule. 10 days of flank speed transit without mechanical failure, without incident, without anyone aboard understanding the significance of what they'd accomplished. The mysterious crate was offloaded immediately. No ceremony, no acknowledgement, just a crane lifting it off the deck and onto a waiting truck that drove away toward the heavily guarded compound at the north end of the island. The same civilian who'd supervised loading in California supervised unloading at Tinian. He nodded once to Captain McVeigh acknowledgement, not gratitude, and disappeared. McVeigh never saw him again. Never learned his name, never knew that the man was part of the Manhattan Project, that the crate contained components of the weapon that would reshape human history. The Indianapolis had just completed the most important cargo delivery in naval history. All McVeigh knew was that his ship had arrived, his cargo was delivered, and his orders were to proceed to Guam for fuel. Then continue to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to prepare for invasion support operations. Standard orders. Routine transit. Nothing special. He filed his departure request with the port director at Guam. Indianapolis would leave July 28, proceed independently to Leyte, following standard routing through the Philippine Sea. The port director approved without comment. No escort was assigned, no destroyer screen, no special routing to avoid known submarine activity zones, just one heavy cruiser, proceeding independently, following a route that would take her directly through waters where Japanese submarine I-58 was hunting. On July 28 at 9 a.m., Indianapolis departed Guam. Captain McVeigh set a course for Leyte Gulf 1,300 miles to the west. 3 days of transit at standard cruising speed. The weather forecast was good, the crew was rested, the ship was ready, they had 61 hours to live. July 30, 1945, Philippine Sea, 11:30 p.m. The ocean was calm, almost glassy, moonless night, but clear enough that you could see stars reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. Warm, maybe 80 degrees, the kind of tropical evening that made men forget they were at war. Indianapolis steamed west at 17 knots, zigzagging according to standard anti-submarine protocol. Every few minutes the helmsman would adjust course slightly 5 degrees left, 5 degrees right, making the ship's path unpredictable to any submarine trying to calculate an intercept course. But at 11:30 p.m., Captain McVeigh made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the zigzagging stopped. The visibility was too good, he reasoned. Any submarine would be visible on the surface, and submerged submarines couldn't keep pace with a cruiser making 17 knots. The zigzagging was burning extra fuel for no tactical benefit. Better to run straight, maintain speed, arrive at Leyte on schedule. It was a reasonable decision, a logical decision, the kind of judgment call that captains made 100 times during a deployment. It was also exactly what Commander Mokitsura Hashimoto, captain of Japanese submarine I-58, had been waiting for. 12 miles away, I-58 cruised at periscope depth, her diesel engines shut down, running silent on battery power. Hashimoto had been hunting for 3 days, patrolling the shipping lanes between Guam and Leyte, hoping to intercept American supply vessels before Japan's inevitable surrender. He'd spotted Indianapolis an hour earlier, massive silhouette against the starlit horizon, moving fast, zigzagging erratically, too difficult to shot, too unpredictable. Hashimoto had tracked her anyway, hoping for an opportunity that probably wouldn't come. Then, at 11:35 p.m., the cruiser stopped zigzagging. Hashimoto watched through the periscope as Indianapolis settled onto a steady westward course. No course changes, no evasive maneuvers, just a massive warship moving in a perfectly straight line at constant speed. He couldn't believe his luck. Solution calculated. His weapons officer reported. Range 1,500 meters. Speed 17 knots. Course 260 degrees. Load tubes 1 through 6, Hashimoto ordered. Prepare to fire. 6 Type 95 torpedoes, oxygen-fueled, weightless, carrying 400 pounds of explosives, each slid into their tubes. The submarine shuddered slightly as compressed air pressurized the firing system. Hashimoto took one last look through the periscope. The American cruiser filled his view, massive, powerful, completely unaware. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, 3 torpedoes launched, then 3 more, 6 weapons in the water, running hot and straight toward USS Indianapolis. Aboard the cruiser, nobody saw them coming. Nobody heard the warning. Nobody had time to react. At 12:05 a.m. on July 30, 1945, the first torpedoes struck Indianapolis on the starboard bow. July 30th, 1945, USS Indianapolis, 12:05 a.m. The explosion tore through the forward hull like a fist punching through paper. Private First Class Giles McCoy was asleep in his bunk on the third deck when the ship lurched violently to starboard. He woke to the sound of metal screaming, not the sharp crack of artillery fire or the dull thud of a collision, but a deep, primal, tearing noise that meant the ship's structure was failing. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in dim red bulbs that cast everything in hellish shadow. McCoy rolled out of his bunk and hit the deck as the compartment tilted at an impossible angle. Other Marines were shouting, scrambling in the darkness, trying to find their boots, their life vests, their battle stations. Then the second torpedo hit. This one struck amidships directly beneath the forward engine room. The explosion vaporized 20 feet of hull plating, flooded 3 compartments instantly, and severed the ship's electrical distribution system. Every light on Indianapolis died, every pump stopped, every communication circuit went silent. The ship was blind, deaf, and dying. McCoy grabbed the nearest life vest and fought his way toward the ladder. The compartment was flooding seawater pouring through ruptured bulkheads, rising from ankle-deep to waist-deep in seconds. Men were trapped in bunks, pinned by debris, screaming for help that wasn't coming. He climbed, hand over hand, pulling himself up through the darkness while the ship tilted further to starboard. The ladder was slick with fuel oil. His hands kept slipping. Someone below him lost their grip and fell back into the flooding compartment with a splash and a scream that cut off too quickly. McCoy kept climbing. He emerged onto the main deck into chaos. The bow was gone, not damaged, gone, torn completely off the ship by the force of the first torpedo explosion. Where there should have been 150 feet of forward hull, there was just jagged metal and seawater rushing in. The second explosion had opened the ship's side like a can opener, exposing compartments that were never meant to see daylight, and the ship was listing, badly, maybe 15 degrees to starboard already, and increasing every second as thousands of tons of seawater poured into the ruptured hull. Men poured onto the deck from Bellasum in uniform, some in underwear, some in nothing at all. Many carried life vests, many didn't. Most looked stunned, moving mechanically, not quite processing what was happening. McCoy found Lieutenant Commander Moore near the starboard rail, trying to organize an evacuation that had no organization. "Where's the captain?" McCoy shouted over the noise of rushing water and screaming men. Bridge Moore pointed up. "He's trying to get a distress signal out." On the bridge, Captain McVeigh clung to the chart table as the deck tilted beneath him. He'd been thrown from his bunk by the first explosion, had stumbled to the bridge in his pajamas, and was now trying to save his ship with systems that no longer existed. The radio was dead. All circuits dead. No power, no communications, no way to tell the world that Indianapolis was sinking. "Get a runner to the radio shack," McVeigh ordered. "Tell them to transmit on emergency power SOS, our position. Under attack. Sinking." A young ensign ran toward the radio room, but returned 30 seconds later, his face pale. "Sir, the radio room is flooded. Nobody's answering. I don't think anyone's alive down there." McVeigh felt something cold settle in his chest. No radio meant no distress call. No distress call meant no rescue. No rescue meant he pushed the thought away. One problem at a time. "Abandoned ship," McVeigh said quietly. The ensign stared at him. "Sir, abandoned ship," McVeigh shouted. "Pass the word. All hands abandon ship. Get everyone off this vessel now." The ensign ran, shouting orders that were barely audible over the sound of the ship dying. McVeigh looked at his watch. 12:08 a.m. 3 minutes since the first torpedo. The list had increased to 25 degrees. The bow was completely underwater now, the stern rising out of the water as the forward compartments flooded. They had maybe 10 minutes before she capsized. Maybe less. McVeigh moved to the rail and looked down at the men already in the water, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, floating in fuel oil and debris, calling for help, trying to swim away from the sinking ship before it pulled them under. He had to get them all off. Or 1,196 men. In 10 minutes, in the dark, with no power, no lights, and a ship that was rolling over beneath their feet. It was impossible. He tried anyway. Chief Petty Officer Edgar Harrell was in the after engine room when the second torpedo hit. The explosion was close, maybe 50 feet forward of his position, and the shockwave threw him against the bulkhead hard enough to crack his ribs. But he was alive. The compartment was intact, and the emergency lighting still worked, which meant he could see the water pouring through the forward bulkhead seal. "Everyone out." Harrell shouted to the engineering crew. "This compartment's flooding. Move, move." They moved. 12 men scrambling for the single ladder that led topside, climbing over each other, pushing and shoving in controlled panic. Harold went last, making sure everyone got out, counting them as they climbed. 11 men reached the top. The 12th machinist's mate, second-class Robert Thompson, slipped on the oily ladder and fell back into the compartment. Harold heard the splash, heard Thompson screaming, and made a decision that would save his life. He didn't go back. He climbed fast, not looking down, not listening to Thompson's screams as the water level rose, just climbing, because going back meant dying, and dying meant he couldn't help anyone else. He reached the main deck just as the ship's list hit 30 degrees. The deck was nearly vertical now, men sliding down toward the starboard rail, grabbing onto anything bolted down, trying not to fall into the ocean that was rushing up to meet them. Harold grabbed a Kapok life vest from an emergency locker and tied it on with shaking hands. The vest was old, probably stored since before the war, and smelled like mildew and rot. But it would float, probably. He looked around for his division, found 3 men clustered near a life raft that had been shaken loose from its mounting. "With me," Harold shouted. "We're going over the side." "What about the captain's orders?" One of them, Seaman First Class Lowell Cox, shouted back. "The captain ordered abandon ship." "That means we abandon ship." Now let's. The ship lurched. Not a gradual roll, but a sudden, violent snap as the flooding forward compartments finally overwhelmed the ship's stability. Indianapolis rolled to starboard 40 degrees, 50 degrees, 60 degrees, 60 degrees, and men who'd been standing on the deck were suddenly falling. Harold didn't jump. He just let go and fell with the ship, plummeting 20 feet into water that was warmer than he expected and darker than he imagined. He went under, deep under. The life vest wasn't enough to keep him at the surface, or maybe the sinking ship's suction was pulling him down. He kicked hard, arms flailing, lungs burning, certain he was about to die in the darkness beneath a ship he'd served on for 2 years. Then his head broke the surface. He gasped, coughed, vomited seawater, and gasped again. The air tasted like fuel oil. The water was slick with it, coating his skin, burning his eyes. But he was alive. He looked back at Indianapolis. The cruiser was capsizing, rolling completely over. Her keel visible now, propellers still slowly turning as if the ship didn't understand she was dying. Men covered every surface, hundreds of them, clinging to the hull, to railings, to anything that kept them out of the water for a few more seconds. And then the ship rolled past 90 degrees and kept going. Men fell like rain, their screams distant and dreamlike. The stern rose higher, higher, pointing almost vertically at the stars. The 4 massive propellers suspended 40 feet above the water. For a moment, maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10, USS Indianapolis hung there, balanced impossibly, a 10,000-ton warship standing on end, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Then she slipped beneath the surface. Not slowly, not gradually, she just disappeared. 1 second there, the next second gone, swallowed by the Philippine Sea with barely a ripple to mark where she'd been. The suction pulled dozens of men under. Harold felt it tug on his legs, like invisible hands trying to drag him down. He kicked frantically, swimming away from where the ship had been, fighting the current that wanted to follow Indianapolis to the bottom. When the suction finally stopped, Harold floated in silence, broken only by screaming. 900 men in the water. No lifeboats launched. No rescue ships on the way. No distress signal sent. Nobody knew they were here. Nobody was coming. And the sharks had already started to gather. July 30th, 1945. Philippine Sea, 12:20 a.m. The screaming lasted for hours. Not the sharp, sudden screams of men in immediate danger, but the sustained, ragged cries of 900 souls scattered across 2 square miles of open ocean, calling to each other in the darkness, trying to find friends, trying to find officers, trying to find anything that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense 12 minutes ago. Dr. Lewis Haynes floated alone, his Kapok life vest keeping his head barely above water, listening to those screams and trying to calculate how many of his patients were already dead. Haynes was Indianapolis's senior medical officer. He'd been asleep in the officers' quarters when the torpedoes hit, had made it to the main deck just before the ship capsized, had jumped and not fell, jumped into the water from the starboard rail as the cruiser rolled over. He'd watched men die on that deck, watched them trapped by debris, crushed by shifting equipment, pulled down into flooded compartments by the physics of a sinking ship. And now he was floating in fuel oil that burned his eyes and coated his throat, listening to hundreds more men dying around him in ways he couldn't see and couldn't stop. He heard someone nearby ragged, breathing, splashing weakly. Haynes swam toward the sound and found a young sailor, maybe 19, bleeding from a gash across his forehead, barely conscious. I've got you, Haynes said, wrapping his arm around the kid's chest, holding his head above water. Stay with me. What's your name? The sailor tried to answer, but only managed a gurgling cough. Blood mixed with seawater and fuel oil. Haynes tilted the kid's head back, trying to keep his airway clear, but he could feel the life leaving him the way his breathing changed from labored to irregular to absent. The sailor died in Haynes's arms at 12:47 a.m., 17 minutes after the ship went down. Haynes let the body go, watched it drift away into the darkness, one more casualty in what was rapidly becoming the worst maritime disaster in U.S. Navy history, and the sun wouldn't rise for another 6 hours. Private Giles. McCoy had found a group of Marines clustered around a floating net cargo netting that had torn loose from the ship during the sinking. Maybe 40 men clung to it, some with life vests, some without, all of them coated in the thick fuel oil that covered the ocean's surface like a toxic blanket. Everyone stay together. A voice shouted from the center of the group. McCoy recognized it. Captain Edward Park, commanding officer of the Marine Detachment. Park had no life vest, but seemed to be floating through sheer force of will. Stay with the net, don't drift off. We're stronger as a group. It was good advice. Men who drifted away from groups disappeared into the darkness and were never seen again. The ocean at night is infinite, disorienting. You could be 10 feet from help and never know it. Swimming in circles until exhaustion or hypothermia or simple despair pulled you under. Stay together. It was the only rule that mattered. McCoy grabbed onto the net with both hands and tried to assess the situation. Most of the men around him were injured cuts, burns, broken bones from the explosions or the fall into the water. Some were unconscious, held afloat only by their life vests and the hands of the men beside them. All of them were covered in oil. The fuel oil was the worst part. It was everywhere. In their eyes, their mouths, their noses. Every breath tasted like it. Every blink spread it deeper into your eyes until everything was blurred and burning. Some men were vomiting from swallowing it. Others had stopped vomiting because there was nothing left in their stomachs except oil. How long until rescue? Someone asked. Captain Park didn't answer right away. McCoy saw him looking toward where Indianapolis had gone down, maybe calculating the timeline. The ship had sent no distress signal. The Navy wouldn't even know they were missing until Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf, which was unscheduled for another 2 days. 2 days, rescue will come, Park said finally, his voice steady despite the lie. We just need to survive until then. Stay together, stay calm, help the wounded, we can do this. McCoy wasn't sure he believed it, but belief didn't matter. Survival did. A quarter-mile away, Chief Edgar Harrell had organized his own group, maybe 60 men clustered around 2 life rafts that had floated free during the sinking. The rafts were small, designed for 12 men each, but 30 were crammed into each one with another 30 hanging onto the sides. Harrell had taken charge by instinct, not authority. In the chaos after the sinking, rank meant nothing. What mattered was who could organize, who could think, who could keep men from panicking and swimming off into the darkness alone. Listen up, Harrell shouted, his voice cutting through the background noise of men calling for help. Every man checks the person next to him, make sure they're conscious, make sure they're breathing, make sure they're tied to the raft. Anyone who's wounded, identify yourself. Voices called out injuries, broken arm, burned hands, cut on the head, missing teeth from hitting something during the fall. Harrell catalogued them, mentally triage in the dark, deciding who needed immediate help and who could wait until daylight. If daylight ever came. What about the captain? Someone asked. Did McVeigh make it off? Harrell had no idea. He'd seen men jumping from every part of the ship, had seen officers and enlisted men alike swept into the water, but in the darkness, covered in oil, everyone looked the same. For all he knew, Captain McVeigh was dead, or floating alone somewhere, or already rescued by another group. Doesn't matter, Harrell said. We take care of ourselves until help arrives. That's our job. That's our only job. He looked around at the faces barely visible in the starlight, young faces, frightened faces, faces that trusted him to know what to do next. The problem was, he didn't. Captain Charles McVeigh had made it off his ship, barely. He'd stayed on the bridge until the list reached 45 degrees, ordering men to abandon ship, making sure the evacuation proceeded as orderly as possible under impossible circumstances. Then the deck had become too steep to stand on, and he made his way to the port rail now, pointing almost straight up, and climbed down the side of the hull as it rolled over. When the ship capsized completely, McVeigh had found himself standing on the keel, seawater rising around his ankles as Indianapolis began her final descent. He jumped just before she went under, maybe a 15-foot drop into water that had been churned to foam by the sinking ship. Now he floated with a small group of officers, maybe a dozen men, including Commander Moore, and several junior lieutenants clustered around a floater net similar to the one McCoy's group had found. "We should organize search patterns," Moore was saying. "Swim in expanding circles, find other groups, consolidate, improve our chances of being spotted." McVeigh shook his head. "In the dark, we'd lose men. Everyone stays put until dawn. Then we assess. Sir, with respect, the longer we wait, the more men stay alive." McVeigh interrupted. "I won't risk losing people to search for people. We wait for dawn." Moore fell silent. McVeigh understood the impulse and need to do something, anything, rather than just float and wait. But leadership meant making hard choices, and the hard choice was accepting that some men couldn't be saved. Not tonight, not in the dark, not without lights or boats or any way to coordinate rescue. All they could do was survive until morning. McVeigh looked at his watch. 2:15 a.m. 4 hours until sunrise. 4 hours of floating in fuel oil and darkness, listening to men die around him, unable to help, unable to even see who was screaming. For hours that felt like forever. By 3 a.m. the screaming had diminished, not because rescue had arrived, but because men were dying. Hypothermia, mostly. The water was warm at 80 degrees, but that wasn't warm enough. Not for hours of immersion. Not for men who'd been burned by explosions, who'd swallowed fuel oil, who'd been injured during the sinking. Their core temperatures dropped slowly, degree by degree, until their bodies just stopped trying. Dr. Haynes had found a larger group, maybe 300 men, the biggest concentration of survivors. He moved among them, checking pulses, assessing injuries, doing what he could with no equipment, no supplies, no light. He found a sailor with both legs broken, bones visible through torn flesh, screaming every time a wave moved him. Haynes had nothing for pain. No morphine, no bandages, no splints, just words. "You're going to be okay." Haynes lied. "Rescue's coming, just hold on." The sailor nodded, believing him because people believe doctors, even when doctors are covered in fuel oil and floating in the middle of an ocean with no way to help. The sailor died an hour later. Haynes felt his pulse stop, felt the body go slack, and let him drift away to join the others. How many dead already? 50, 100, more. How many would be dead by sunrise? Haynes didn't want to calculate. Did he want to think about the mathematical certainty that more men would die tonight than had died in the sinking? The ocean was patient, relentless. It didn't need torpedoes or explosions. It just needed time, and they had nothing but time. At 4:30 a.m. the first shark arrived. Nobody saw it, not in the darkness, but everyone felt it's a sudden surge of panic that rippled through the groups as men screamed and thrashed as something large moved through the water below them, as the primal terror of being prey activated in 900 human brains simultaneously. Shark, shark, the word spread like fire. Men pulled their legs up, clustered tighter, grabbed onto rafts and nets and each other. Those without life vests dove under the surface better to hold your breath than float helpless, while something with teeth circled below. The shark-an oceanic whitetip, maybe 10 feet long, cruised through Dr. Haynes's group, its dorsal fin occasionally breaking the surface. It wasn't attacking, not yet, just investigating, curious about the strange floating objects that had suddenly appeared in its territory. But it wasn't alone. More fins appeared. To sharks, 410, drawn by the scent of blood from the wounded, by the vibrations of 900 men treading water, by the instinct that something vulnerable had entered their domain. The sharks circled, patient, testing, waiting for dawn, waiting for the feast to begin. July 30th, 1945, Philippine Sea, 6:42 a.m. The sun rose over an ocean, stained with fuel oil and blood. Private Giles McCoy watched the horizon brighten from black to gray to pale orange, and for the first time in 6 hours, he could see what surrounded him. He wished he couldn't. Bodies floated everywhere, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some wore life vests and drifted face down, dead from injuries or exhaustion or fuel oil poisoning. Others had no vests and hung suspended just below the surface, visible as dark shapes in the clear water, arms outstretched as if reaching for help that never came. And among the bodies, the living scattered across miles of open ocean in ragged groups, their faces blackened with oil, their eyes red and swollen, their voices hoarse from calling for help through the night. McCoy's group around the cargo net had shrunk. Maybe 30 men now, down from 40 at midnight. 10 had slipped away during the darkness, too weak to hold on, too injured to survive. or simply giving up and letting go because holding on hurt too much. Captain Park was still there, still organizing, still keeping men focused on survival instead of death. "Sound off," Park ordered. "Everyone call out your name. Let me know you're conscious." The roll call was ragged. Some men answered clearly. Others mumbled. 3 didn't answer at all, unconscious or dead, hanging in their life vests. Still part of the group, but no longer part of the living. "We made it through the night," Park said, his voice carrying across the group with forced optimism. "That's the hard part. Rescue will come today, maybe this morning, definitely by tonight. We just need to stay strong." McCoy wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that somewhere, someone knew they were missing, that search planes were already being scrambled, that rescue ships were steaming toward their position at flank speed. But a small, cold voice in the back of his mind whispered the truth. Nobody's coming. A quarter-mile away, Chief Edgar Harrell was discovering the same terrible reality. His group had survived the night. Relatively intact 52 men still alive out of the 60 who declustered around the life rafts at midnight. But dawn revealed problems that darkness had hidden. The life rafts had emergency supplies. Harrell pulled them out systematically: signal flares, fishing line, water cans, first aid kits. The flares were soaked, useless. The fishing line was intact but meaningless without bait or hooks. The first aid kits contained bandages and morphine syringes, valuable but not enough for 50 injured men. And the water cans. Harrell opened the first one and found it empty. Not just empty, bone dry, as if it had never been filled. He tried the second can, also empty. The third, the fourth, all empty. Someone had failed to fill them, or had filled them years ago and they'd leaked. Or they'd never been meant to hold water at all, just to look official during inspections. It didn't matter why. What mattered was that 52 men floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean had no fresh water. Harrell stared at the empty cans for a long moment, then quietly put them back in the raft storage compartment. No point in telling the men, not yet. It would only create panic, and panic killed faster than thirst. But the clock was ticking. In tropical heat, without water, a man could survive maybe 3 days. Maybe less if he was injured. Maybe less if he was swallowing seawater or fuel oil. 3 days. Harrell looked at the horizon, searching for rescue planes, for ships, for anything that suggested help was coming. He saw nothing but empty ocean. Dr. Lewis Haynes's group, the largest concentration of survivors. Nearly 300 men had organized itself into a loose formation during the night. Now, in daylight, Haynes could assess the true scope of the disaster. The wounded were everywhere. Burns from the explosions, lacerations from debris, broken bones from falls, fuel oil poisoning, hypothermia, shock, and he had no medical supplies, nothing, just his hands and his training, and a growing certainty that most of these men would die. But he worked anyway, moving from man to man, checking vitals, offering reassurance, doing the small things that doctors do when there's nothing else to do. He found a sailor seaman first class Felton Outland with both legs shattered below the knees, bone fragments visible through the torn flesh. The wounds were already infected, red and swollen, attracting small fish that nibbled at the exposed tissue. "Doc," Outland whispered, "am I going to make it?" Haynes looked at the wounds, at the infection, at the fish, and knew the answer was no. Without surgery, without antibiotics, without even clean water to irrigate the injuries, sepsis would kill Outland within 24 hours. But Haynes smiled. "You're going to make it. Rescue's coming. Just hold on." "How long?" "Soon, you promise?" "I promise." Outland nodded and closed his eyes, believing the lie because people need hope more than they need truth. And Haynes understood that hope was the only medicine he had left to give. By 8 a.m., the sharks had returned. They'd left during the darkest hours of night, but dawn brought them back, dozens of them now, maybe more, drawn by the blood, and the vibrations and the primal understanding that 900 wounded creatures floating helplessly in open water represented an opportunity that nature could unignore. Oceanic white-head sharks, 6 feet long, 8 feet, 10 feet, not the massive great whites of popular imagination, but dangerous enough. Opportunistic predators that followed ships, that fed on the remains of naval battles, that specialized in hunting weakened prey, and everything in the water was weakened. The first attack happened in a group southeast of McCoy's position. A sailor nobody remembered his name later had drifted slightly away from the others, maybe 10 feet, hanging in his life vest, too exhausted to swim back. A shark came from below, fast, invisible until the moment it struck. The sailor screamed once high and sharp, then disappeared beneath the surface in a cloud of red water. He came back up 3 seconds later, still screaming, his left leg gone below the knee. Bone and tendon visible in the stump that pumped blood into the water. The other sharks smelled it immediately. They came in a frenzy. 5 sharks, 8 too many to count, churning the water around the wounded sailor, pulling him under, tearing him apart in full view of 50 men who could do nothing but watch and pray they were next. The attack lasted maybe 20 seconds. When it ended, the sailor was gone, just gone. Nothing left except a spreading red stain and the memory of screaming, and the sharks were still there, still circling, still hungry. The attacks continued through the morning. Not constantly, but regularly enough that everyone lived in sustained terror. A shark would single out an isolated man, someone who drifted from their group. Someone too weak to fight back, and the water would explode in thrashing violence. The survivors learned quickly: stay in groups, stay close together, don't splash, don't panic, don't bleed if you can help it, don't drift away. But following those rules required strength they didn't have. Men with broken bones couldn't stay still. Men who were injured couldn't stop bleeding. Men who were exhausted couldn't stay conscious. And men who were unconscious drifted. Private McCoy watched 3 men taken by sharks between 8 a.m. and noon. Each attack was sudden, brutal, and over before anyone could respond. The sharks weren't hunting, they were culling, taking the weakest, the most vulnerable, the ones who couldn't defend themselves. McCoy understood, with cold clarity, that he needed to stay strong, stay alert, stay in the center of the group where sharks wouldn't come, because the moment he showed weakness, the moment he faltered, he would become prey. So he held onto the cargo net with cramping hands. He kicked his legs periodically to stay warm. He helped support the man next to him who'd lost consciousness. He did everything possible to appear strong, even though he was dying inside, 1 hour at a time. From dehydration and exhaustion and the slow poison of swallowed fuel oil. By noon, the sun had become its own enemy. The tropical sun beat down with relentless intensity, raising the surface water temperature to blood heat, baking the oil-covered survivors, causing hallucinations and heat stroke and madness. Men started drinking seawater. Dr. Haynes saw it happen. Rational men, disciplined sailors, suddenly cupping seawater to their mouths and gulping it down despite warnings, despite screams from their shipmates, despite knowing intellectually that seawater would kill them faster than thirst. But knowledge didn't matter when your throat was sandpaper, and your tongue was swollen, and your brain was cooking inside your skull. Don't drink the water. Haynes screamed at a sailor who was gulping seawater by the handful. It'll kill you. Stop. The sailor ignored him, kept drinking. His eyes were wild, unfocused, seeing things that weren't there. Within an hour he was convulsing. Within 2 hours, he was dead, kidneys shut down, brain swollen, body destroyed by the salt concentration his cells couldn't process. And he wasn't alone. Dozens of men drank seawater during those afternoon hours. Dozens more would be dead by nightfall. Captain McVeigh floated with his officer group, watching his crew die around him, and felt the weight of command crushing him like the ocean pressure. This was his fault. He'd stopped the zigzagging. He'd made the ship an easy target. He'd failed to get off a distress signal. He'd failed to ensure lifeboats were properly deployed. He'd failed to save his men. "Sir, you need to stop," Commander Moore said quietly, reading McVeigh's expression. "This wasn't your fault. I commanded the ship. You followed standard procedures. Any captain would have made the same decisions, and any captain would be wrong." McVeigh looked at the bodies floating nearby, at the wounded men screaming as sharks circled, at the growing realization that hundreds of his crew wouldn't survive to see rescue. "How many are dead?" "More. I don't know, sir. Guess." Moore was quiet for a moment. Maybe 200, maybe more. 200 dead. In 12 hours, and rescue hadn't even begun. McVeigh closed his eyes and let the sun burn his face, and wondered if he'd survive long enough to face the court-martial that would inevitably follow. If anyone survived at all.